Illinois School Card Report.
I am moving so that you can all see the slides, and so I don't have to be on camera, which makes it even better. Girls, don't turn the camera. So the Illinois School Report Card comes out every year. This was released on Halloween this past year, and what it really is looking at is data from last school year, but the report is just released out every year. So just a little bit about a district overview. So just starting with our school designations, we had one exemplary school, which was the high school, and all 4 of our other buildings were under the commendable status, which is really exciting to see for our district. There's our evidence-based funding information there, so you can kind of get a financial picture of where we fall in the district. A little bit about student mobility. So 5% of our students in the district move in and out, and a lot of them sometimes within the same year, or sometimes they'll leave us this year and we'll see them back in a couple of years. But there is a mobility rate, and every time a student changes schools, it takes about 3 years to get caught back up, which seems like a lot, but if you're jumping from one curriculum to the next and then back, you're getting a lot of gaps and holes through that. So that mobility rate plays a really big piece in when you're looking at your student data. And then our average class sizes this year sit around 22, and that is all district data compared together. So again, for our teachers, you can see we have 159 teachers in the district, which is up from last year. 44% of our teachers have a master's or higher, which is really exciting to see those teachers pushing themselves to the next level, but also is what allows us to have dual credit classes at the high school, is when you have that master's degree. On our teacher evaluations, 98% of our teachers are scoring in the proficient or excellent range, which again just is another piece of data that shows how great the teachers in our district really are, and how much they care not only about their students, but about this district and their profession as a whole. And then we have 3 teachers that are nationally board certified, which is an extremely rigorous process to go through, and just elevates your teaching upon that as well. So the elementary and middle schools are scored on these indicators. So there's an ELA and a math proficiency. So that's how many students reached the target of mastery that the state has set for their grade levels in ELA and math. Science proficiency, which is scored in, or the test is taken in 5th, 8th, and 11th grade. So again, it's that how many students have met or mastered the proficiency level at science. ELA and math growth then looks at, okay, while students may not have reached what the state deems as a meets or a proficient standard, they want to look at how the students are growing. And so you would expect a student to have at least 1 year of growth in a school year, but the data that we receive actually breaks it down, and so we can see how much those students are growing in comparison to other students in their same bracket. So it's not how much did they grow closer to proficiency, but it compares a student that started in that exact same spot as them last year, and then it looks at how they are in comparison to each other the following year. Chronic absenteeism is our number of students that miss 10%, which is 18 school days or more of the school year, and it doesn't matter if it's an excused or an unexcused or a mental health day. It's 18 days total, and so that's why parents, you're getting all of those reminders and phone calls and text messages, and students were doing all of those different incentives and reminders and all of that, because it really is important not only for your education, but our district is rated on that rating as well. English learner progress is working with those English as a second language students within the district and watching their progress as they've come into the United States. And then the climate survey is the 5 essential survey, and this is really just based on a participation score, but the principals utilize that information a lot. I know when we did the school improvement plan presentations for you all, you saw the principals refer back to that 5 essential data, so it is really valuable information that we utilize that comes from the community, the staff, and the students as well. So Bethalto East was a commendable school. So in their schoolhouse, you can see that they were scored on ELA and math proficiency and growth, and then also chronic absenteeism. The reason those 3 boxes at the bottom, so the English as a second language, science proficiency, and the climate survey, are not in the house is because Bethalto East doesn't get a score on that. They do not have 20 or more English as a second language students in their building. They do not take the science assessment, and their students don't take the climate survey. Students don't start taking the climate survey until 4th grade, and so they don't get a score for that one. Because those 3 pieces are not in the house, those percentages that I just showed you change. So you can see that they take those 3 scores, which were each worth 5%, and they distribute that 15% to other categories. So chronic absenteeism then takes on a much bigger weight in determining our score, just as ELA proficiency and math, and then the growth as well. So the other thing that makes Bethalto East pretty unique is the scores that they receive on their report card is based on how our 3rd graders last year scored. So these are students that Bethalto East hasn't seen for at least 2 or 3 or 4, right? Like years. But it's because the federal government requires all schools to be scored, and there is no other test that's at the pre-K, K, and 1 level that is consistent across the state that all schools can be scored on. And so that is why Bethalto East scores is based on the 3rd graders' scores the year before. They will tell you that the caveat is those students had to have attended Bethalto East. So any students that moved in and did not attend Bethalto East, those scores come out of their calculation. But typically you will see as we go through these, Bethalto East and Parkside scores will mirror each other quite a bit, except on absenteeism. That's the only one that Bethalto East truly has their own control over that situation. The percentages that are on there are again just showing, we know that ELA proficiency was worth 8.86%. And so the first number, the larger number that's in front of it, just shows how much of that percentage point that the school earned, and then they take all of those, and that's how they figure that overall score to determine their score. So just to kind of break it down a little bit, again, this is Bethalto East. This is the only chronic absenteeism that they have control over, and so you can kind of see over the past couple of years, they've made substantial growth since the 22-23 school year. Last year was a little bit lower than the previous year, but again, if you remember back to last year, we had about a 6-week stretch where everybody that you talked to was sick or had someone in their family that was sick, and that really took a hard hit on a lot of our schools. And then this is where Bethalto East does a lot. They mentioned in their school improvement plan to work towards, they do all the eagles in the nest, and they get to have a party after they've reached so many days. So they're doing a lot of things to help incentivize, to help raise that score back up. Okay, Parkside, so like I said, their scores are gonna look very same thing. They don't have those 3 indicators. They again scored in the commendable. Again, those indicators, that 15% was distributed out. So this is their ELA. The blue is their proficiency. The purple is their growth. So you can kind of see as it goes on, the proficiency scores, how close we were to earning all of the possible points in those areas. Growth then, again, was we have some room to work on some growth, but those are already conversations that our guiding coalition teams are having about what does this look like, what can we do, and then also thinking about how can we use our Eagle time, because you'll see when it goes to math that our Eagle time with proficiency, Parkside earned all of the possible points for proficiency this year, which means they met that state target for the number of students meeting that, and I think a lot of that is due to the fact of the Eagle time that they have instituted and have started using and are focusing on math skills. So we're gonna apply that same concept to the ELA and hope that our hypothesis is gonna work out the same when we look at the scores for next year. Again, you can see they have really done a great job with increasing their attendance as we've gone on, and so again, they're doing a lot of incentives in the classrooms with attendance, talking about it, really getting that information out. That information goes out to the teachers. The teachers are reminding the parents all the time, so it really is a whole building effort to increase that score. Meadowbrook was commendable, but if you'll notice, they now also have the climate survey points and the science proficiency score because they do, the 5th graders take the science test. So the only category they don't have is the English language learners in their building. So they only had 5% then that had to get distributed amongst. So their weight looks a little bit different than Bethalto East and Parkside's. But again, you can see here that they have consistently done a really nice job of hitting those proficiency targets over the last 3 years and getting the students. That proficiency target changes every year, which means they're getting more and more students to reach that proficiency target. And then you can see with ELA growth, we still have, as Mr. Newell likes to say all the time when he and I have conversations about school report card, there's a lot of points left on the table. So we know that that's an area that we're going to look at. Again, that comes back to our interventions, reteaching strategies, and how we do those things. So then the story remains the same with our math, but you can see, again, they've made a great jump, almost a whole percentage point over last year in the math proficiency. But again, growth is an area that we're working on. With them departmentalized, they really started looking at how that breaks apart, and now they're working on interventions and how to get that going a little bit more to get that growth score up. Science proficiency, I will say, if you remember back when we did the school improvement plans, we talked about how the state right-sized scores this year, so meaning they took everything onto the same calendar. So what a proficient in on the IAR means the same thing as a proficient on the science assessment, and it means the same thing as a proficient on the ACT. Well, when they started right-sizing those scores, they realized that they had been scoring science much too easily. So it is a lot more difficult to get a proficient on the science scores now because they've changed the cut scores so dramatically. So while yes, there is a drop, there is part of that has to do with the fact that that cut score jumped all of a sudden between the 23-24 and the 24-25 school year. And then again, their chronic absenteeism, that cold last year, or that virus, whatever it was that was going around, really took a hit out on Meadowbrook. But again, they're doing quite a bit to work on that. Trimpe was a commendable school, and again, they have all those same indicators that Meadowbrook has. So again, they just had 5% that was distributed across those scores. And then again, it's the same story. You can see that for the past 3 years, they've been meeting that ELA proficiency rate, which is really great. And then for ELA growth, kind of hovering around in that same area, but again, it shows we've got some room to work on. Those are conversations that have already started this year at the middle school level about interventions and utilizing everyone and every time that we have at school. Here's math. And again, I know we talked last year, or I'm sorry, at the last meeting with the school improvement plans about how math across the state is down. It took a massive hit during COVID because ironically enough, kids weren't at home practicing math facts. And even though you think, oh, well, my kids weren't at home reading, they were reading the captions on the TV, or they were reading on their video games, or they were reading something, even though it might not have been educational stuff, they were reading. They weren't practicing their math facts unless you were taking them to the drive-thru and asking them to figure out the change for you. So that's part of the issue. The other part of the issue too, I forgot to mention earlier with math, but I'm going to talk a lot more about in January when we do our data review, is when you look at these proficiency scores, the math test actually becomes more difficult every year. So, and what they say is average for a student is what is expected in 3rd grade. By the time you get to 8th grade, you need to be amongst the 69th percentile of students to be able to just meet. So I'm going to break that down a little bit more when I talk about the data quality review, because we have a different data set that kind of helps explain that a little more. But math, it's known, but there's also research behind it to show that math is much more difficult for you to make proficiency and growth on. And then here's the science. Again, it's that same story where, you know, we obviously have room to grow, but that drop is not as quite as shocking as it initially looks when you look at the numbers. And then here's our attendance as well as you look at this. I just had a meeting with Trimpe today, and we were just talking about how they're currently already 3% better attendance now than they were this time last year. So we're hoping that that trend hangs on and will help pick up in these areas. So high school, though, is judged on a different set of standards. And so high school looks at that ELA and math proficiency as well as science, and that all comes from the ACT. Then it looks at your graduation rate, and that's your 4-, 5-, and 6-year graduation rate. So students that graduate on time, students that graduate 1 year late, and students that graduate 2 years late. That's worth half of the score at the high school is your graduation rate. 9th grade on track, so that's the students that we're tracking Fs. So again, parents of high schoolers, that's why you're getting constant messages from Mr. Newell and the teachers about where your students are with grades, but it is 9th grade on track, which correlates directly back to graduation rate, right? And so that's why it's important to keep track of that from the very beginning. Chronic absenteeism, climate survey, and English language progression is on there as well. So, I don't know if you haven't heard the news, but the high school was exemplary this year. Mr. Newell offered to let me bring the trophy over. I was a little nervous. I didn't really want to be the person in that video that like dropped the trophy and it shattered, and now I'll live on social media forever. If you ever are unsure about this, you just need to go check out Mr. Newell's wrist, because as you read in the paper, it really is tattooed on his body, so he will never forget this score. And he is proud to show it off, as he and all the other teachers and staff in that building should be. It was a lot of hard work, a long time coming, but absolutely well-deserved from the students, the staff, and the parents for them. So like I said, so they have those same weight indicators. The only one that they don't have is the English language learners. They don't have 20 in their building. So you can kind of see then here as it goes along that ELA and math proficiency. So they've continued to work really hard on pushing those students up towards it. You know, you heard Mr. Newell talk about how the teachers took the ACT to see what the questions were like and do that. They've modeled their CFAs after those as well. So again, all the things that they're doing is just, here's the data and the evidence to show in another way for you. Graduation rate. So again, earning all of the points that you need to do that. And then that 9th grade on track, right? Mr. Newell at the assembly talked about how he really thought last year's freshman class was gonna do him in, and the number of meetings he had, keeping them on track with their scores. But again, it helped, but this was an area, as soon as I sat down with the high school team this afternoon, they said, we got points on the table with 9th grade on track, so we're gonna start adding this and this and this. And I was like, I love it. And as parents and a community, you should be thrilled to know that they're already, you know, continuing to push forward. They haven't stopped just because they reached that exemplary status. Science proficiency, again, you can see that kind of hit that science took with the right sizing of the scores. Chronic absenteeism, kind of hovering around in that same area. And then all of this is really just to think about, it's a continuous improvement of cycle, right? So you heard me say a couple times, like I've been meeting with the teams already, and we're talking about next year. The teams are utilizing their guiding coalitions to think about what can we do. The PLCs, which is why it's so valuable to have those Wednesday afternoons that teachers can get together, analyze the data, and start making a difference and making changes and tweaks so that we can continually keep pushing forward. With obviously our ultimate goal is, you know, for me to be able to stand up here and say we have 5 exemplary schools, because we have 5 amazing schools in this district with really wonderful staff. And so to get that state recognition would be really exciting to have. Are there any questions?
That's amazing. Is there any discussion at the state level about looking at absenteeism differently moving forward, Alyssa?
So next year, it will be the same, but instead of calling it chronic absenteeism, it will be called students in attendance. So instead of looking at who's not at school, they will be looking at who is at school. So again, it's that same, it'll be the same number. So instead of having a 15% chronic absenteeism rate, you would have an 85% student in attendance rate. But yes, they're gonna start flipping and looking at the positive of it. There are some other changes that are coming, that are being proposed on how to do this right now. Like I talked about, that target you heard Mr. Newell talk about on that October 1st, he and I were constantly hitting refresh, trying to wait for that score to come up. And it's because it's a constant moving target of what you're trying to reach. With this new proposed state accountability system, it is set targets. So at the end of the year, and once we get our preliminary state testing scores back, we will be able to sit down and graph it, and we will know exactly where we're going to fall at that point. Like I said, which then gives us a chance to constantly monitor throughout the year that we're approaching those targets.
Was there any scuttlebutt at your meeting? I know at my meeting last week there was discussion about math scores across the state of Illinois all went down. Did you hear anything at your meeting last week with people in your role that their districts were experiencing similar, that their growth in math had gone down?
So math in general, yes, there's constantly been kind of this conversation about math in general has kind of taken a hit. The state had put some things in place to help out after COVID. For 3 years, they kind of put like these intermittent tests that you could take to kind of help find out exactly where students were. The state decided that after 3 years, schools didn't need that anymore, so they cut that option off. But yes, that is a trend, not only across the state, but really across the country. And like I said, COVID took that initial hit, and then with our test in Illinois, it's an additional hit because it's not comparing apples to apples when you look at the rigor of the test. I think probably the greatest analogy that I heard was it's like you're at a horse event and you see, you know, the horse jumps over the first one and they goes over one pole, and then the next one they go to, they're jumping over 2 and then 3 and then 4. And it doesn't look at how many poles you had to jump over. It just looks at how did you do. And so that's kind of what has happened with the math test. Some have, I'm not going to say easy, because if you've ever proctored a math test, they're wordy and complicated, even at the 3rd grade level, where I've proctored a 3rd grade math test a couple times, and I've thought, hold on, I would have to do this, and then this, and then this, right, to go through it. But yes, they're not taking into comparison the difficulty of the test is getting harder, and not just like you would think, oh, well, sure, 8th grade math should be harder than 3rd grade math, right? It's not about the difficulty of the grade level standard, it's about the difficulty of the test itself.
Thank you.
So, and like I said, I have more data that'll kind of explain that a little bit more in January. Yeah.
As the kids transition from building to building, you guys use this data to know what you're looking for when those kids come, on how you can kind of enhance some of these areas of opportunity that they may have in the growth area?
Yes.
With the principals and that, to know, like, okay, what am I looking for when this grade comes into my building? How do we need to work with those kids?
Yep, so we kind of do it in a couple of different ways. So one of the ways is our intervention teams that go from one, or like we'll meet with one building to the next, and they'll really talk about, okay, these are the students we've been working with at like tier 2 and tier 3. Here's what we've been doing, here's what's worked successfully. So that's kind of been one way to help those students that are kind of struggling already. Another way that we really look at this data is all of this information, along with their scores, feed into a program we used called EduClimber, which I knew nothing about until I came to this district last year, and I absolutely love the program. You can very quickly pull up a student and see all of their past historical data on how they've scored, how they've done as a group. And then yes, they have access to the test scores from the year before. So if you wanted to look at like the whole grade level report, you could take a look at that and get an idea of what's coming in. Anybody else?
That's awesome.
Great job.
Thank you.